This is the ArtWorks Alliance podcast, where we discuss the value and transformative potential of participatory art. Hello, it is Monday the 3rd of March 2025, and this is an ArtWorks Alliance podcast with me, Rob Watson. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by Kate Stanley from Frameworks UK. How are you, Kate?
Very good, thanks, Rob.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we've got a kind of general idea of the kind of issues and topics that we want to cover. I suppose the first thing to do is really introduce yourself and who are you? How did you get into what you're doing and what you do now?
Yeah, great to be here. I run an organisation called Frameworks UK. We're a not-for-profit communications research organisation. So there's a lot of words in that sentence just to unpack. So we do research to understand the best ways to communicate about social issues. We believe that communications is too often left as a kind of intuition-based practice where there's received wisdom and people go with their guts. But we know that communications is a science, and there are empirical, evidence-based answers to the questions of how we should communicate about issues. So that's the work that we do. We do the research to understand the best ways to talk about important social issues.
Okay, that's really interesting. I've got an interest in this. So my other work is as community focused communications, and it is very much more in that kind of ad hoc, loosely defined way of working. So it's less strategic, if you like. So I'm really interested now on two levels. Is I suppose the first part is we want to think through how this applies to arts and creativity and what we might call community arts and the participative nature, the participatory nature of art, but then also that kind of more structured sense that how do people, what do we need to do to help people recognize and understand the value of some of that activities, those social activities, those social gain, social benefit activities in terms of how did you get into what's your background then? How did you get into doing this?
So got into this primarily because my last role was as a director at the NSPCC. So I was director of strategy on the executive board there and recognized that we had a problem in how we talked about child abuse. Because had been hugely successful in raising the importance and the recognition of child abuse as an issue. But we were seeing declining numbers of people believe that it could actually be prevented. And we were the National Society for the Prevention of Child Cruelty, not for the raising of the awareness of child cruelty. So that simply wasn't good enough. So I commissioned a US organization called the Frameworks Institute to come and help us to think about how we should be talking about child abuse, to really soft that dial so that people did believe there's something that they could do about it and that the NSPCC was part of that solution, and so were they. So complete reframe of the issue from being all about perpetrators to what all the rest of us could do. And I'd come across Frameworks on a leadership program I'd been on and saw that they were basically doing a kind of research that nobody else was at that time, really getting into how people think about social issues and using that to test communication strategies that could move hearts and minds. So in essence, I saw reframing the issue of child abuse as a strategy question, right? So I was director of strategy, not director of comms. But this was so fundamental to who we were at the NSPCC and what we did that we had to look at it as core to our practice and all of our decisions. So that's how I came across the work. And I found the work they did for us at NSPCC to be so compelling and so important that I wanted to be able to help other organizations to benefit from that kind of research that could really shift their strategy and their thinking and therefore their communications about their issue. Before that, I worked in think tanks in policy influencing. And I know obviously how important framing is in the world of politics.
So you've got
all about the story.
you've got the if you like a small group of people. Policy is about influence, and a small group of policy makers. Often these are very cliched terms, aren't they? But a small group of people who are directly responsible for framing policy and legislation, things like that. But the NSPCC work sounded like it was a broader, more social understanding. Is that
Yeah, well,
right?
in the end, it's all about just a wide audience of people. So that's because it ultimately, you might be seeking to influence politicians, but you need a story that they can tell to everybody else because they're there by consent, right? They're there through a democratic process. So it's no good just having a conversation that's purely designed for them. It has to work for a general public audience too. So I'm always all through thinking about what's the story, not what's the story for this individual, but what's the big picture story that they can then go on and tell to make the case for this policy or their party or whatever it might be. For me, it's always about talking to the broadest possible audience. I think there's a big risk and there's kind of a received wisdom in communications that it's always about breaking down your audiences into these little segments and these little, but actually that way madness lies because who of us can really segment our audiences to the level of precision? Okay, Google can. Who else? Not many of us have got the budget or the time to do that. But worse than that, when you're telling a different story to a different person, it's inauthentic, right? Feels inauthentic. And secondly, a story over here could backfire for this group of people over here. I'm interested, and at Frameworks, we're interested in stories that you can tell without fear of backfire actually are going to work for most people, or they might work more for some than for others, but they're not going to push anybody further away. And they're the kind of strategies we can really use, especially communicating about social issues where we don't have much resource. We rarely have big comms teams. We don't have big budgets. You need to feel confident that your messages aren't going to backfire for any group.
So if let's spend a few minutes thinking about what was wrong and maybe what continues to be wrong in many places, because I agree there's an expediency for many communications managers to how many minutes, how many lines in a newspaper article, how many posts, they're measurable. And they can put a report in front of the CEO to say, we've spent this money on comms, we've done this and we've achieved this. And that always strikes me as being a very kind of limited, transactional and narrow view, because you're right, you dice and slice with I really do hate this phrase, demographics, because it's 99.9% of the time people are using that phrase in the wrong way. They're applying it for something which is actually more about statistical analysis over, kind of large scale metrics, and people use it as a general sweeping term when what they mean really is culture, or they mean social groupings or something like that. But so what in your experience and in that moment when you realized that you needed to employ something to reframe the way that you worked, what did you recognize and intuitively maybe feel that was wrong, and then how did that express itself explicitly?
It wasn't that we were speaking to the wrong audiences, that we were telling the wrong story. I'm far less interested in audience than I am in story, because the right story, we have to think story first. We have to start with what it is we've got to say, and then who we're saying it to comes later. We can tailor our message to adapt to different audiences. Absolutely. And that's where the creativity comes in. But it should always start with what's the story? What is it you've got to say? What is it you want people to know and understand? What are you trying to build support for? And being absolutely clear about those things, and then figure out who and how and what and all the rest of it. But start with that essence of what it is you've got. And NSPCC is the example. We had a story that focused on child abuse being perpetrated by bad people doing bad things. And that's not wrong. However, it's only a part of the story, and it doesn't tell people what can be done. It plays into this kind of fatalism that exists, the big problem that's too big for us to solve. And it feels quite hopeless. Instead, we needed to tell a story about what could be done and what could be done to prevent child abuse from happening in the first place. And there are lots of things we can do. And so we needed to start articulating that and saying that and talking about what we actually believe to be the case, talking about those aspects of the story. So it was about getting that right, really, and getting the core of what we did and what we believed out, instead of just being having this quite narrow tale that we're telling. I'll give you another example from a partner of frameworks that we work with now, Impact on Urban Health. So they're a foundation based in London, and they have got a mission to reduce levels of childhood obesity. They started out, they wanted to halve them in 10 years. We did some work to figure out how was the best way to talk about this issue, to kind of get people on board with the mission, right? To win allies and to make something happen. And what we found through the research was when we talked about childhood obesity, it immediately triggered ideas about parents making bad choices, letting their kids eat whatever they liked, right? Basically, people need to eat less, move more, and give their kids better food. None of which is very helpful if what you want to actually do is increase the options that people have, right? Make good food more available for people. This is what the foundation wanted to do. They wanted to see a reduction in marketing of junk targeted at kids, a reduction in the number of chicken shops or sweet shops by schools. They wanted to change the food that surrounds kids so that there were better options available, make it more affordable. So what we found is when we stopped talking about childhood obesity and started talking about children's health and food, so health first, we didn't trigger that blame anymore. We didn't trigger that judgment. We didn't trigger that kind of dismissal of bad parenting. Instead, people were like, fully understood the importance of children's health, its relationship to food. They could see the role for policy in reducing that of marketing that goes out to kids, in improving the quality of food that's available to them, school dinners being better, fruit and veg more affordable, more available. Complete shift in who needs to do what, just by shifting that frame from obesity to health. So that's the kind of thing.
I suppose it becomes it's an empowerment model, isn't it? I always think that it's a term I feel very uncomfortable using. Somebody said a permission model is often talked about. I don't need to give anybody permission to do anything, to think differently, to act in a particular way, to use whatever assets and skills they've got to change something. And somebody said to me, "No, but you inspire people." I'm like, well, I'm very uncomfortable with that. I'm English, I'm British. I don't have that sense of kind of confidence that you're out there. But in a way, that reframing does that. You stop it being a judgmental, a negative, an ingrained, embedded, stereotypical judgmental issue. So suddenly it's about empowerment of children to live healthy lives and to live, free lives. I mean, in the fact of the absence of children in our neighbourhoods, in cities, large cities and towns these days, we will look back in the future and think this was a criminal act in many ways, but that the freedom for the child, and that's often the voice that never gets heard. So how as an example, how was that translated into those stories? What was the what drives that process then in terms of how do you make that relevant and resonate with people to as they pick up that change? Once you start telling those different stories, what was the difference with the types of stories that were being told?
One example would be anyone who's walking around the streets outside this office here in Southwark next month will see billboards that are from an organization called Bite Back, and they're youth activists, and they have a campaign that says, "Fuel us, don't fool us." And it's targeting the big food companies and saying, give us nutritious food. Don't con us by telling us this stuff you're packaging up as healthy and targeting us with is good for us. It's not. So they've got really feisty about it in a way that it's brilliant to see. To say no, they want to shine a light on these practices and draw people's attention to what food companies are up to with their marketing. So people are all around this borough will be able to see those billboards and at bus stops making this point about, we need to clamp down on these companies. So that's one version. Another version of the story is one that's being told by he was the food czar for Boris Johnson, but we shouldn't hold that against him, Henry Dimbleby. He's a brilliant campaigner for better food for kids, alongside Dr. Dolly Van Tuliken. And she is a health expert. And they've just done a policy report around this. And in it, they don't talk about childhood obesity because actually they know what that triggers. Right? They triggers all this blame story. In it, they talk about food-related ill health. Because actually, obesity isn't the problem. It's illness that's the problem. And it's the illness that comes as a result of food. So it's food-related ill health. And we tested these phrases and found that when people talk about food-related ill health, instead of obesity, you can build this understanding and you can get much further. You can build support for your policies around government legislation and the food companies and so on much more quickly, much more effectively. So it comes out in different ways depending on the audience. And this is how people, once they're equipped with these ideas, and that's what we're supplying is ideas about how to tell stories, and they can run with them in their own way that makes sense for them.
With I've followed Dr. David Unwin, who's a campaigner. He's GP in Southport. If anybody checks him out on Twitter, him and his wife Jen are quite active, and they've become quite big in this area of challenging the myths of the industrial food production process, which promises us something. And I always think this is it's a really good analogy for our media. Is that industrialized, produced? You walk along the supermarket aisles, and there's a guy, Michael Poolen, who writes and he says, "Don't shop the aisles." An American context, but it's valid here. You shop the edges. That's where the fresh food is, the meat, the vegetables, the dairy. The aisles are full of processed, manufactured food. And I always say to people, you can envisage that, can't you? And they kind of say, okay, well, that's how our media works as well. They're producing food like products which are marketed at you, which are and what was the phrase that you used? It was kind of feed us, don't con us, or something like that. It's kind of
fuel us, don't fool us.
Yeah, and that's a great expression. For much of our media is produced in the same way. So the science behind you kind of started off by saying that there's the science behind this. Can you just kind of explain what type of is it behavioral science? Is it what kind of elements of that's the first thing that comes to my mind that might be applicable. So if I'm wrong, please do kind of explain where it might originate.
So our methods are rooted in anthropology, cognitive anthropology. So the study of culture. And we're thinking about culture in mind, how culture exists in our minds and in the ways that we think. And in cognitive linguistics. So in the ways we think and therefore also the ways we talk. And it's really rooted in those framing theories, rooted in those disciplines. And what we're doing in our research is we spend time having one-to-one lengthy interviews, and long may this continue, where it's two human beings speaking to each other, and lengthy interviews, and where we're trying to understand how people think, how they reason about an issue, about a social issue. So we've just been doing a big project on oh wait, the rule of law. How do people think about the role of law in our society and if it matters and how it affects them? Um, and we're and that's the kind of topic that people aren't thinking about much, or maybe a bit more at the moment compared to usual with everything that's going on in the States. But they're not thinking about it much. So what we need to know is how, if ideas about the law come up, what do they draw on from their mental models, their ways of thinking to inform how they respond? Because that's what we do every time we hear something. We don't try and figure out the world afresh every day. We draw on the mental models that we carry around with us in our heads. And then we share these mental models in our culture. So we're looking to understand the kind of patterns of reasoning that exist in a culture that people are using to figure out the world. And some of these ways of thinking, a classic way of thinking is individualism. You would give you credit for everything you've achieved and we blame you for everything that's gone wrong, right? Is a classic mental model. So that's a dominant individualism is a dominant mental model in our society. But we'll have other models in there as well. The idea of kind of collective responsibility, that we all do have a responsibility to one another and a duty to look after one another in some way. So our job as communicators is to avoid the mental models that are not going to help us, the ones that are going to shut down the conversation, and tap into those mental models that are actually going to be quite helpful to us. So if I can tap into the idea of this kind of collective responsibility when it comes to child abuse, for example, thinking back to NSPCC, that's going to help build this idea that organization exists to bring us together to do something different. It's going to help build a case for policy. Whereas if I'm tapping into individualism, bad people doing bad things, where do we go with that?
There's a tendency at the moment, if you're online and following discussions on, heated civic political discussions online, to kind of label everything at the moment as ideological, and that could be a framework which is used a lot, but it kind of it only serves. I find there's a number of words which are kind of are running out of steam and running out of usefulness because they've been used a lot. And actually, that the classic example is community. What do we mean by the word community? Is, well, it's like I know it when I see it type thing. Well, can we put a definition of that together? But ideology is a word that is used in the wider political debate. The headline debate, if you like, to it's like tennis, passing a ball back, so no, you're the ideologues, no, you're the ideologues, and it kind of doesn't really. I try and avoid it. I'm a pragmatist in the sense that you need to look at what works, but how that notion of culture within and cultural resonance, how important is that to these frameworks? And because what is a pattern of meaning if it's not culture and the because we the challenge, I suppose, is that we now live in a society, we do in the UK and we do in our city, in our major cities, live in places where there are people who have perhaps different cultural frameworks or different patterns, meaning patterns that they're working with. How are you kind of recognizing or dealing with that as a challenge?
So what we try and do is identify the most dominant ways of thinking about a given issue. Um, and and we do this by speaking to people across a range of different with a range of different characteristics and backgrounds. But it's amazing the commonalities that you find. The same mindsets come up time and again from people who you'd imagine would be coming at the issue from very different life experiences. So we identify these common patterns of thinking. And they're the ones we know we either want to tap into because they're there already and they're useful and we can use them, or the ones we want to avoid because they're actually probably going to be unproductive for us and unhelpful to us. So for sure, people with different life experiences, different backgrounds will think differently. Um, and we want to uncover all that. But we will also find these patterns that are common across culture. And that's what we want to shine a light on. And that's what then becomes a tool for communicators. Because once you know what's out there, what your messages are landing in, right, you can predict with some degree of confidence how it's going to work out, what's going to get you in trouble, get people thinking in unhelpful ways, what might be quite useful to you, what might resonate more strongly, feel more salient. And that's the point. You mentioned before, Rob, a lot of organizations just don't have budgets to do anything but go with their intuition when it comes to communications. And that's exactly right. But that's the beauty of this research, is that you can use it to inform your communications, even if it's not specifically on the thing you need it to be. There's some principles of good framing that anyone can use, and that's available to anyone to take a look at, to inform their communications and not fall into some of the traps that we see happen all the time.
I feel it's often the case that people will suppress their intuition because they think they've got to go with and I'll use the phrase, you've used the phrase, but a scientific model. But their understanding
Mm.
of what a scientific model is more akin to, if you like, an electronic engineering or a computer algorithm, a logic model. Whereas that doesn't necessarily, a scientific approach doesn't necessarily imply, it could be an ecological model, a more holistic type, a cosmological model. It could be a different paradigm frame set of ideas. What, I suppose, what the do you work with organizations that have say, if you like, a top down approach, and organizations that have a bottom up approach? How does that framing, because if you're a government department and you've got to say, the pandemic taught us this, is like the nudge unit that was set up by David Cameron and within government, in order to be able to bring about, facilitate or support certain activities within society, and that, to a sense, they were useful. In the experience that we had in Leicester, where I'm based, which is the longest lockdown in the country, was that actually it was ineffective because the meaning framework in which people brought to this didn't correspond with the framework that was being used from the top down. Is there
Mm.
is there a challenge there?
All work tends to focus less on behavior change and more on policy change. We tend to think the answer is rarely get those people to do something different, be better. It's We're more interested in the kind of systems and policy framework, practice frameworks that exist. So so behavioral theorists and people like, for example, working in nudge are focused on those kind of tweaks that we can make to get people to do something different. Most of the time in our work, what we find the challenge is actually to help people stop focusing on what individuals need to do better or different and start focusing on how the system needs to be better or different. So most of our communications recommendations are about trying to draw attention to how policy works, how government works, how it could be better, and what could be done to achieve that. Because that's normally where the gap is. People are very quick to say, oh, Rob, you should be, I don't know, walking more often, to be healthy and reduce the strain on the NHS. People will tell you a dozen things that you ought to be doing better. But hang on, let's look on the other side as well. What needs to happen to make it possible for you to walk more? Does there need to be pavement and that patch outside where there isn't one? Does there need to be a green space that you can get to? Does there need to be a transport, a bus running? So we tend to find that's where the gap is, to communicate that part of the story, not what Rob should do differently. There's a
Yeah,
role for that, but that's not for us.
Yeah, that you learn, don't you, that the word should is always banned. It's never a word that I let people use. We should be doing this. We should well, we've got to look at what this, and blaming individuals is often the wrong way to deal with that. When if you live in an urban sprawl that's got fast moving traffic and high pollutant traffic, then and broken pavements after which haven't been repaired for 20 years, what are you going to do? It's like it's blaming people rather than facilitating and supporting people and inspiring people to use the environment that they're in. So the kind of they want to tie this into participation. And because I think what you're touching on in a way is that the individual is expected to be part of this process of understanding, because it's not that you go around to each individual. It's got to be a broad message that communicates across cultural social groups and places. But there's an element here where you're saying this has to resonate as much as possible with the individual, so that they have that opening up and realization that it's, as you say, it's not a behavior change, but it's almost like a possibility change.
Yeah.
How do you encourage that into the process?
So once we've done those interviews with individuals to understand and uncover these patterns of thinking, so we know what's out there, we then design frames or ideas that might help shift people's thinking, might help make the case on a particular issue. Let's say we want to make the case for, I don't know, participatory arts, right? When we've identified how people are thinking about these issues already, we've got a good sense of where we need to be. So when we can design a kind of framing strategy, which is basically a set of ideas about how we want to tell our story, at that point, we then test those ideas at a large scale. So we use an online quantitative experimental survey. So that's a survey where we test the effects of different ways of making the case with a large number of people, demographically representative group of people. Typically it'd be up to 5,000 people. And what you're doing is figuring out which frames increase people's understanding and support for participatory arts. Then you find out what works, what doesn't. You've got your framing strategy. You can then revise that in focus groups to find out how they work, how those ideas work in real life conversations, not just survey format. What happens when it, hits actual conversation? And then you refine the strategy. That then gives you a properly tested strategy that if you do these things, it's going to help you. And your only task then is to figure out how you want to do it, how you want to tailor those messages for your audience, knowing what you know.
We've had a shift in the context, haven't we? Which is a change of government and this isn't a party political point in a sense, but it's maybe an administrative point. Is that the Lisa Nandy, the Secretary of State for Communication, Media and Sport, is more aware of and more motivated by the distributed, community-focused arts culture as being a priority for government, as a good in itself to have that widely spread. In the meantime, while there's that good intention at the top, we're trying to figure out how to get that. I mean, from the ArtWorks Alliance perspective, to get that participatory notion into policy process and practices and collaboration with organisations, whether it's the Arts Council or health authorities or education organisations. What are the limits to what you can do with the framing process as a, I'm trying to put this in the right way, as a kind of if you like, a self-contained process, and how do we take it down those levels, if you like, to bring about culture change and cultural expectations within. I mean, we'll see this in, for example, there's an awful lot of transition about to happen with incapacity benefits for people out of work, and that the organizational structures and expectations of people within the job centres and the Department for Work and Pensions are shifting and changing from a fairly judgmental model to something which is more supportive and facilitative, and that's widely recognised now as being something which was a failing on the last setup, to being something which needs to change anyway. Whatever government was in place, you'd need to change that. How does that then, you can maybe have a meeting with some of the directors of policy and the directors of organizations, but what enables them to filter that through into the bones of the organization? Sorry, it's like a massive question, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe just if I put that in my own kind of simplistically, my one challenge we have is, if you've got a reasonably sympathetic government, how do you make your case so that it actually then delivers? How do you make it? When I worked at a think tank, I worked at IPPR, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He really wanted us to be making a good case for continuing to spend money on child poverty. Make the case and make it well, for goodness sake.
Don't push at an open door in that
Yeah,
sense.
he was like, I need this to be seen to be under pressure to do the right thing that I want to do anyway. So if you find yourself as a sector in a position where you think somebody wants to do the right thing, that is the time to double down on the pressure, not to back off, right? So put it in simple terms, for me, the challenge is then, how do you continue to make that case in the most compelling way possible upwards to policymakers? And how do you, and it's honestly, it's not a different story, right? It's telling the same story to whomever you're talking to. It should be, we shouldn't be talking in such often convoluted or jargony ways that we can't say the same thing to everybody. You might want to flex it a bit, what's appropriate in different contexts, sure. But really, it's just about them being consistent. Because look, I don't work in the field of participatory arts, but it's quite hard to it's quite hard for you. It's quite hard for that sector to get its voice out, right? So those times when it does, it needs to be consistent, saying the same thing relentlessly. So being consistent and also amplifying one another, echoing one another's message, not with your, off in multiple tangents. So it feels more of a symphony than a cacophony. It's incredibly important, especially in quite a fragmented sector, or a sector made up of lots of different small organizations. So really, more than anything, I think it's about being consistent.
And it's that sense of, it's a movement rather than any single organization. So one of the things that's hard to explain to people about the participatory approach, whether it's media or arts, is it's like a patchwork, and people are all doing different things for different reasons in different ways with different outcomes. And often people will be quite hesitant to look at that. Well, it's like, well, how do we manage that with a single policy framework? And it's kind of, so you've got this tension, that Jungian notion of holding the tension of the opposites, which is, you've got the desire for bureaucracy to conform things and centralize things, but you've got the cultural life, which is diverse and multiple and often a patchwork of different experiences. And it's kind of finding a way how to frame that so it's those people who are kind of focused on a more homogenized view are able to understand the people with the more what's the word I'm looking for? It's heterodox kind of view, and vice versa. So that there's a mutual understanding between them.
So this is where values come in. The recommendation that we would have would always be to focus the story around values, because actually nobody's really interested in the detail anyway, right? What people want to know is why does this matter? What's important? And any compelling story, this is the advice that we would give to an organization in the sector we're talking about, would be to start with why it matters, not with what you do or who you do it with or where you do it, or that kind of detail, but instead why it matters. Is it because of the importance of human potential and giving people the opportunity to meet their potential? Is it because of the value of human ingenuity? That's a value that can often really rally people. Um, is it for the sake of our collective national prosperity? This has a value in terms of social and economic well-being. There's different values that might be used, but leading with values creates that kind of brings people under an umbrella, and you can worry less about what's different and be united through that shared set of values, or that shared value that you focus on.
What are the is I mean, it's easy to be negative and apocalyptic at the moment. I suppose we can always be like that. But what are the kind of stories that you're picking up on that you interact with that actually enable you to be hopeful? Is there anything? I mean, you mentioned that the campaign about food packaging and marketing. That sounds incredibly interesting. Are there other examples of things that you kind of? I suppose it's the what gets you out of bed in the morning question, isn't it?
Mm.
It's one of the stories that appeal to you, and because we can theorize these things, as you said. You said this earlier. It's like we can put this into a framework which is separate from our human impulses, if you like. It's a rationalized framework, whereas actually as you say, you want to know what it is that matters to you. What is it that gets people? What are the kind of things that you and your colleagues
Mm.
maybe are passionate about, and which is driving them, that you point to as a good example?
This is kind of an unusual project for us because it's not in the UK, but I think it points to something that um, really strikes very deeply for me. So we're working in Bulgaria to help people working there end the institutionalization of children. So lots of children every year in Bulgaria and in many, many countries around the world are separated from their families and placed in orphanages. They're often not orphans. They often have parents, and they're put in these institutions because they have a disability their family is struggling to cope with, or their family is too poor to look after them in the way that they want to. And so they're pulled away from their families and put in these places. And then no child should grow up in an institution. Every child should grow up in a home. Um, and so we're working with partners in Bulgaria to try to tell the story more better, tell the story of why actually families are where children should be, not institutions. Um, and of course, you can imagine the children who end up in these places are disabled. They're often Roma. Um, they almost always from poverty. So we're working with them to try to fight against this practice and help the organisations there kind of end the practice and keep more children together with families. And what we're finding is actually, and what I suppose I'm inspired by, is the way organizations there have been able to really connect with the work we've done. And they are using some of the kind of more populist, nationalist ideas of family that exist in Bulgaria and flipping them on their head to say, and that's why we shouldn't have these institutions. Talking about the importance of family stability.
You've actually just connected something for me, which was we saw some trouble in Leeds last year, where there were some Roma families and there was a bit of civic social disturbance and kind of violence, and that you just made me realise by mentioning that the ingrained expectations of having your kids taken away from you is that we have a different model, which hopefully is more benign. But leave others to kind of explain that. But the expectation. So yes, of course, people who have, if they've come from that kind of cultural background, so it has resonance elsewhere. It doesn't, it's circles of influence, isn't it? It plays out across very many different places and in many different circumstances. But you're right, if you get that story framing right and that understanding that people can buy into. So there's that sense. I'll try and wrap up with in a second, because I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, and this might be one of the first conversations we have. Hopefully we'll have a number of them, but it's that kind of symbolic resonance with a story, which is, we don't just, I think one of the things that's often forgotten about is the mythological element, and something that I'm kind of more interested in is the symbolic nature of our storytelling and the symbols that we have within society and the way that we communicate, and the way that they deeply resonate across society in different ways. And often that's the part that's forgotten about. It's addressing, I mean, it's all very well telling people to get a vaccine because it might save their lives, but if you come from a religious tradition which is fatalistic, and you believe in a reincarnation, and your time, it's then that's that. It's not the same way of communicating that paradigm, that framework of meaning. And we're struggling in many ways because we don't have those institutions of meaning making that are often, so community arts, community media, the things we're involved in, are places potentially where we can reinvigorate those places of meaning, those institutions of meaning, to give people some security. I mean, how we do that it needs to be discussed, but the fact that we have them would be a benefit, I think.
And just to take that thought down to something more, I guess, prosaic, basic in nature, is the kind of visual framing is obviously as important as the words we use to tell our stories. The example that we talked about before about children's health and food, we realized that when we wanted to represent where the field, when journalists wanted to represent issues around children's health and food, the stock images that were available to them were these ones of people's backsides, rather large backsides.
Yeah,
You see people walking down the street, there's usually two of them.
yeah.
Um,
The
that's
overflowing
basically,
midriff,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. And we're going to show you their back, so to protect their dignity. Well, not really, because what it's doing is dehumanizing them. Um, doing all kinds, it's triggering those kinds of they just need to eat less ideas, right? So we worked with an agency to create a deck of images that instead focus on children's health and food. So you've got cute little kids standing in the supermarket aisle with all these brightly colored, beautifully packaged, ultra processed foods at their eye height, all around them, or a group of teenagers walking past, a billboard the size of a house with a burger on it. These kind of ideas, instead shining a light on the food environment instead of the literal size of somebody's behind.
And that very visually, I can picture it in my mind, is that it shifts the point of focus from the blame to the individual who is being exploited to the exploiter. Because for every person who suffers from food addiction, for example, is somebody who's been preyed upon. It's like, for maybe a bit extreme as an analogy, but every junkie has a dealer, and
Um,
somebody preying on them and exploiting them. And our food system is very imbalanced in that sense. And so having that reassertion of some kind of balance at least
yeah.
is quite.
Not to say there's not a role for individuals, of course there is. But the point is that story's being told, and it's the only story in town. And This work is about actually saying there's another side to it. Let's look at that for a change. And that so often is the what we find is the task.
And the thing I like about the food as an analogy for this is that once you teach people to cook and food, prepare food for themselves from fresh ingredients, or there's a joy and a pleasure that comes from that empowerment of being in control of your own cuisine. I mean, you know, for good or ill, the French do this much better than almost anybody else in Europe, and I mean they spend a lot of money on it, but they've got the lowest rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome in Europe, and we have got the highest rate of consumption of processed food, and therefore the highest rate of diabetes and obesity in Europe. So it's causation and correlation are, are kind of closely linked, aren't they? In this instance, what's what projects are looking forward to? What are you working on that you're gonna, this I'm intrigued with this. I think there's a gap for participatory arts and the ArtWorks Alliance to kind of look at this notion of the creative impulse and response to some of these things. So these huge challenges, strategically thinking this, but as each of us have individual creative responses to these things that we can. I mean, one of the big challenges is having images, and so I do a lot of work about trying to encourage people to be community reporters, to create and produce images that can be shared and used, which aren't the kind of stock photographs, everybody looks like they're in a Gap advert, and they're kind of really professionally lit and everything. It's just ordinary people taking ordinary photos of their neighborhood, and it's that kind of shift from thinking that we can't do anything about these challenges to something where you say, well, I can play a role because I can take a photograph on my phone and share that. It's not exploitative and it's not antagonistic. It's actually it's got some social benefit to it.
Yeah, I guess one of the projects that feels really relevant is where we're thinking about homes, and well, so the reframe there is in this country we tend to see homes as a source of wealth, and the narrative is very much about your home as a source of wealth. And what we found is there's a need to shift that story to your home as a source of health, your well-being, your physical and your mental well-being. And if we make that shift, we can help people understand the importance of building more homes, of having everyone be able to access somewhere that's decent and affordable. Not that where a foundation for a good life, if you like. And I think that's the kind of story that can be really powerfully told visually through the kind of photography that you're talking about, right? Because too many of us live in homes that aren't good for our health, that aren't the foundation for a good life.
And the images of which are given to us by international corporations that aren't interested in, and now they can be artificially produced as well.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating, and I hope we can kind of uh, get you in, and we can help with connection with kind of our colleagues in our network and our community of practice to be able to hopefully extend and support that dialogue, and kind of link together at some point and amplify each other's work, because I think this is it's we want to try and, as part of the work that we do as the ArtWorks Alliance, is to really reframe what we do about participation as that benefit for the individual, what it actually produces as a transformation for people and their people within their communities and places. So it's been fantastic to talk through all of this. Is there anything that we've not talked about that you wanted to mention? And then I always finish off with, where can people get in contact with you? So.
The only thing I would want to just finish by emphasizing is the importance of when colleagues are making the case for the work that they do in participatory arts. I think to lead with the value of what it's for, to lead with that connection to those motivating values, that this is about human potential, whatever it is about for them, but to lead with that, I think is going to be the most powerful way to make the case for the work and help people understand its significance and the role it can play. And so we're at frameworksuk.org. The hello at frameworksuk.org is always on. And all of our research is kept on there, and the resource in the library. So everything there is available, open source to access. And there's some kind of framing 101 kind of ideas there as well for people who are interested in kind of improving their communications based on the research.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time. If you've enjoyed this conversation, we have more at ArtWorks Alliance, artworksalliance.uk. Please consider becoming a member. We offer a sliding scale membership, so it's pay what you can afford for both individuals, freelancers, and organisations. And watch out for us on most of the social media platforms that we're across. But until next time, thank you very much to Kate, and we'll speak to you soon. You've been listening to the ArtWorks Alliance podcast. Find out more at artworksalliance.uk or search for us on social media, ArtWorks Alliance.